Hey Constance, how you doing?
Hey, Sarah, I'm good. I will not be on camera today. I am as remote as you get in a sort of wonky Wi Fi cell area. So today you'll have my lovely photo to chat with.
No, no problem. I'm really excited for today's guest. We have Charles Gaba joining us from ACA I don't know how much you're familiar with him, but he has this site that just tracks numbers of ACA enrollments throughout open enrollment and then year over year. And as we'll hear from him, what started out as what he thought was going to be a 6-month hobby really turned into an 8-year passion project and going.
That's so cool. I am excited to hear kind of the trajectory that he'll take us through, beginning when ACA Obamacare was in development to today, where it's highly leveraged for those who need support in getting coverage. So this will be really interesting to hear his statistics and his experience in tracking what's going on with ACA.
Absolutely. Should we get started?
Let's go.
Well, Charles, thank you so much for joining us today. Charles is a health industry wonk and the founder of ACAsignups.net. We're so glad that you were able to give us some of your time today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm I'm actually I was for a long time just an independent website developer, and I sort of stumbled into healthcare policy analysis about what was it, 8 years ago now, and somehow it sort of took over my life, and that's what I do now. So.
And so when you say you stumbled into healthcare, was there a catalyst? How did you get into healthcare?
Sure. Yeah, basically I'm a numbers wonk and data wonk. And back in the fall of 2013, when the ACA was just getting launched, they were just sort of rolling out the ACA exchanges at healthcare.gov and the various state exchanges. As a data guy and as a website developer, I was just really fascinated by how well this was going to work. And then, of course, on October 1st, 2013, they launched, and it didn't work. It was,
yeah, we remember that.
Yeah, for the most part, there were a few of the state exchanges that were fine, but the major one, the federal exchange, healthcare.gov, along with most of the state exchanges, had terrible technical problems, and it was just a mess out of the gate. And I was really interested in seeing. I mean, I knew that they were going to fix them.
Right.
There had been too much blood, sweat, tears, political capital, money, just too much had been poured into this for failure to be an option. So I knew they were eventually going to work it out, but I was really interested in when and how that would happen. And I was really curious, after all the fuss that had been made over the Affordable Care Act, how many people were actually enrolling, were actually going to sign up for coverage through these new exchanges. And what I found was that the government wasn't really releasing a lot of data, partly because of the technical problems. They may not have had access to it, partially because I'm assuming that they knew that the numbers were not very good at first, so they were a little shy about releasing that. But and they were too busy trying to fix everything. But what I was really surprised by is that the mainstream media was not doing a very good job of that either. I figured that they would be all over this, because news publications, they love horse races, and they love watching numbers climb and colorful graphs and charts and stuff. And but that wasn't really happening. And there were a few outlets that were kind of doing it, but like they were reporting things like how many people visited the website, and that doesn't tell you anything,
Right.
or how many people created an account. And again, I know people who created like 3 different accounts just because they were testing it out and trying to get it to work. So that didn't mean much. So as a hobby, I just decided to start tracking through crowdsourcing. And my original idea was to have one person in each state, be sort of my point person to report on whatever they heard, any news stories or interviews or press releases or whatever from that state. And then I would just compile them all onto a spreadsheet. And there were people who helped me out, initially in a lot of states. Eventually, I sort of streamlined the process to the point where I'm doing most of it myself. And originally just started out as just a spreadsheet, just tracking numbers of how many people were signing up, and things just sort of went from there.
So you were attracted to the chaos and then wanted to see where the numbers led you. That's what I'm hearing.
Something like that. I mean, obviously I want people to, as many people as possible, to have, quality, affordable healthcare. But yeah, at first it was really just about tracking the data.
Well, and it's interesting because in addition to tracking the technology, the industry was sort of trying to track the support systems around that. So were brokers allowed to do A, B, or C? Would they get commissions? In which states? Were navigators going to be, average Joes, or would they be highly trained? What local resources, on-site resources? There was all this kind of chaos around, great, there's a website, but like, we can't figure out how to use it or who should use it and how we're actually going to get these people signed up.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, I mean, that first open enrollment period, as I'm sure, you both remember all too well, it was just nuts. It was, for those who, younger, who may not recall, the first enrollment period, it lasted 6 months. And actually it was 6.5 months, because they ended up having to tack on an extra 2 weeks at the end, because there was such a backlog of people who were of demand. People weren't able to get in for the first month or so, and so at the tail end. And again, I mean, of course there were all sorts of technical problems, there were structural problems, but they did eventually work it out. They brought in sort of a crash team to fix the biggest problems in terms of traffic and server load and things like that. One of the main things they did, this is probably one of the biggest like thought process errors that I think that they made, was at first the idea was that you had to create an account and input your information before you were allowed to window shop. Like if you wanted to see whether you qualified for subsidies, that was not available at first. And the reasoning was, I believe the rationale was that if they did that, then people were going to be confused or something. There was some sort of rationale behind it, but it was just completely backwards. And so they did quickly open that up, to let people, window shop and see what they would save. And that was a big help. And there were other things as well, but yeah, so it started out as that, and it just grew from there. And this was supposed to be just like a 6-month nerdy wonk hobby thing that I did. And then I was just gonna like, okay, done. And then I was, once open enrollment period ended, I was going to go back to being just a quiet, website developer. But instead what happened is I sort of, things went sort of viral. And the next thing I knew, I became like known as this like Obamacare guru or whatever.
Yeah. Your 6 months turned into nearly 8 years at this point.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going on the 8th year of this. So, this is
over those 8 years, there's been a lot of changes and improvements in a lot of ways. The technical difficulties. CMS has their enhanced direct enrollment partners, of which WELL is one. So you've got these private entities who can really focus on the technology part and then communicate back and forth. But one thing that is interesting about even the reporting of the numbers, and even now, 8 years into it, when the news media is reporting the numbers, is that there's a difference between the federally facilitated marketplace numbers and all of the different state-based marketplace numbers. So I was hoping maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that, including who's moving to a state-based marketplace this year, and what does that mean?
Yeah, and I would also add the why, Charles. Why are people moving either direction, FFM or state?
Yeah, that's been a really fascinating, again, from an industry wonk perspective. There's a lot going on there that's happened. The first year in 2014, I think there were 16 state-based exchanges, and then there were like another half dozen or so that were what are considered federally facilitated state exchanges, where they have where the state has its own legal entity and they have its own board of directors and budget and that sort of thing. But they're basically, it's still hosted sort of off of healthcare.gov, the federal.
They're using the federal platform, right?
And so for the average, enrollee, that they might as well be on the federal exchange. But of course, what happened in the second year? Well, first of all, two of the states, Massachusetts and Maryland, I mean, since so many of the state exchanges had technical problems as well, they had to decide, what are we going to do? And they made different decisions. So Maryland and Massachusetts, they decided to stick with a state exchange, but completely throw out what they had and overhaul and revamp it and launch it for the following year. And they were both very successful with that, and they did it in very short order, which was pretty impressive. And their new exchanges launched, pretty much problem-free. There were a couple of states like Hawaii. Hawaii's, I think there's lasted 2 years, I think, but it was a complete disaster from every perspective, and they just scrapped it completely and went completely home to the federal exchange.
Right.
Then there was Nevada and Oregon, which both they did the same thing. They scrapped their state exchanges, but they went to the federal exchange, but they became facilitated. So they still had their own entities, but they just again were hosted by healthcare.gov. Since then, a couple of years ago, Nevada split back off again. They went back a few years later, created their own new exchange from scratch,
Right.
and this one's working great. They're in their second or third year of that now. And then there were a couple like Kentucky, which theirs was one of the few state exchanges which worked perfectly. It was great right out of the gate. It won all sorts of awards. It was very popular. Everybody loved it. But then they had a new governor come in who basically just got rid of it, and they went back to the federal exchange. And then this year, now they have a new governor now who is supposed to be bringing that back. So starting this fall in November, next couple weeks actually, Connect is supposed to be coming back, and there'll be some differences, some changes to it, I'm sure. But so they're the first state to have their own exchange, go to the federal, and then have their own exchange again. But in addition to that, you also have, I mentioned Nevada 2 years ago. Last year, Pennsylvania and New Jersey split off from the federal exchange onto their own platforms. And then this fall, besides Kentucky, you also have Maine and
New Mexico.
New Mexico. Right. Yes, of course. Yeah, New Mexico. New Mexico was supposed to have their own exchange the second year. And for whatever reason, they just never got around to it, or there were, maybe legislative changes or something. And so it's a few years late, but they're finally getting to that. And then Maine is the one that really, really surprised me at how quickly that came together, because they basically just decided we're going to do it, and then they're just doing it. I thought they weren't going to actually be making the move for another year or two, but it turns out here they are. So, and then next year, Virginia is supposed to be moving to their own exchange, and I've heard there's some talk about like Oregon is going to do the same thing Nevada did. But yeah, there are a lot of exchanges. So more and more states are basically moving away. First, they were moving on to the federal exchange after the technical issues. Now, a few years later, they're starting to, more and more states are starting to set up their own exchanges. And there's definitely an upside to that, which is more local control. And also they can do things that states hosted through the federal exchange can't. For example, California, New Jersey, and a few other states are offer their own supplemental subsidies, financial subsidies.
Yeah.
And if you're hosted through the federal exchange, you can't do that. I'm not sure if that's just for technical reasons or also for policy or procedural reasons, or both. But so there's a lot of things. You have a lot more freedom and flexibility to do some interesting things when you have.
Charles, as you've seen the states come on and off their own exchanges, or just promote the exchanges, let's maybe think about it that way. Here we are in some form. Have you seen the types of plans that payers have put onto the exchanges have a trend one way or another, and also the number of payers that have opted to participate or not participate?
Yeah, that's I don't know how much of that has been related to whether they're on the federal or state exchange, but that seems to be dictated more by federal political changes to the law and so forth. I know that, for example, in 2015, one of the last big lawsuits over the ACA, King versus Burwell, there was, had that gone the other way, then any state that didn't have its own exchange was going to lose all subsidies, which basically would have massively crippled the ACA in all except for the states that have their own exchange. But it was ruled, the ruling went the other way by the Supreme Court. So that sort of was a big sigh of relief to everybody. And I made a prediction when that ruling came out, like the day that ruling came out, I said, so what does this mean for state exchanges? And I said, well, it takes away the immediate threat. But I said, I could easily see over the next few years, as the technical problems are worked out and it becomes more of a, commodity, out of the box kind of solution, I could see more states, deliberately choosing to split off. And that's exactly what started to happen. But in terms of participation, that again, I know that in 2016, there was this massive abandonment of the exchanges, both federal and state, by some of the biggest carriers, United Healthcare, Humana, and Aetna. They bailed on like dozens of states all at once. So there was suddenly this massive drop off in carrier participation. There were worries about there being bare counties and so on that wouldn't have anybody. But over the last couple of years, now that all those lawsuits are out of the way, especially the last big one over the summer, which was the Texas case, which threatened the entire ACA. With all those out of the way, now that it looks like the ACA is kind of here to stay, there's been a lot of the carriers have started participating again. The market has stabilized more, and so it's more of a safer bet now. So they've expanded quite a bit in a lot of states.
I agree with that. I think we're seeing a lot of that with some of the big carriers coming back in, some big names even coming in this coming open enrollment. Where do you see the future of the FFM versus SBM? Do you see that everyone's going to have their own exchange at some point, or what is your prediction? I guess I would ask.
Well, if you go back to when the ACA was originally passed, it was actually, the original idea was for each state, all 50 states, to have their own, individual exchange. And that was supposed to be a compromise. The idea was that would win over, they were hoping to win over some support of, more Republican politicians and such, who are more about states' rights and local control and all that. So it was originally set up for that. And the federal exchange was supposed to be really, it was envisioned to be just sort of a backstop for a handful of states that might not have the resources or the market enough to support their own. Instead, what happened was that, again, most states basically said, I'll just go on the federal exchange. And that's what led to the whole King versus Burwell case. But again, as the dust is cleared, the law seems to be, bite my tongue, relatively safe now. The technology has advanced dramatically, and it's become more streamlined and smooth and easier to set up an exchange. And they've learned so many lessons along the way. I think more and more states will gradually, quietly, move off here and there. It's with this year, so there's been 16 states on their own, and I'm including DC as a state, of course. So there's 3 more coming online this year, so that'll bring up to 19. There's probably 2 or 3 more, including Virginia and 1 or 2 others next year. I could see it being like half and half, like 25 on, 25 with their own. Beyond that, it depends. Again, there are like Hawaii, they tried it, and for whatever reason, I don't know if it was mismanagement or technical issues, whatever, they did, like I said, they didn't just drop their exchange and go to federally facilitated. They are completely a federal exchange state now. So maybe they never will. I don't know. It's really about the cost benefit as well to the state. I know that at the time, Nevada, when they made their decision to break off, the main reason that they gave, and they were very open about this, was that the user fees for the carriers were, for the federal exchange, healthcare.gov, were just like way too high for them. And they were like, well, we can do it ourselves cheaper and less expensive. And that was the main impetus. Since then, those user fees have been cut down somewhat at the federal exchange. So I don't know if that's a major thing anymore, but there's always going to be considerations for that, and I think it'll vary depending on the state. But my guess is it'll probably settle in at around half and half would be my guess.
Yeah, one of the things that we often talk about, and even with some of my broker clients, we talk about is just this idea of EDE, enhanced direct enrollment, that with the federal exchange, you can have a seamless shopping and enrollment experience where you don't leave the platform. If it's a third-party platform, whether it's a health plan or a web broker, you can have the whole thing there. With the state exchanges, that's not something that's really been facilitated yet. You always have to redirect to the exchange, which is a little bit of a disruption to the member shopping experience, and also to the health plans. You can't keep them in your bubble of your plans only. You go to the state exchange, you see all of them. So as the numbers of state-based exchanges increase, we're all very interested in keeping our finger on the pulse of what does that mean for this EDE type of technology where you can keep them in one shopping experience.
Yeah, I mean, the ideal, in my view, the ideal situation would be to have, the APIs and, to have the software, the backend set up so that a state could have its own full, independent platform, its own state exchange, but have it also, be tied into the federal exchange to the point that, as you said, an EDE would be able, whether you go to, healthcare.gov or to the individual state exchanges or through an EDE, that it would all, work together from the enrollees end, because they don't care, somebody signed up for some health insurance, they don't give a crap, whether it's
they have no idea EDE versus this.
I think the most controversial thing that's coming up is going to be in Georgia. I think that's important to mention, which they put through this 1332 waiver that was approved last year by the Trump administration, but which is being reviewed now by the Biden administration, in which they're basically looking to completely abandon any official, government exchange, whether federal or state, and leave it completely open. Basically have the EDEs or the the carriers themselves be the ones where it's all being run through. And that's something where like I have no problem at all with EDEs, but I think that should be in addition to, not in place of. And once you get into completely taking the official exchange out of the picture, that's where I have a problem with that. And so that's what they're talking about. They're talking about whether to, reverse themselves on that at the federal.
Well, we're talking about hundreds of payers, having to have the capability and the support system around that, which is just totally unreasonable, especially for some of the small carriers.
Or to partner with a third-party vendor.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, you also get in the other problem with that is that you get into things like, if a carrier, are they going to list their competitors? Well, if they're not required to, they're not going to, and things like that about how the plans are displayed. There's actually Washington State. There's an interesting thing going on there where, they were the first state to launch their own. They call it a public option, sort of a quasi public option. It's still a private plan, but it's like designed by the state, and and they call it Cascade Care. And what I noticed there is if you go to the Washington State Exchange, the default listing, when you bring up all the plans, the default listing there tends to favor the Cascade Care plans, right? Which are, again, these public option plans, which makes sense, but it goes into the question of, there's a lot of ways that that individual sites can choose to display their wares, just like Google with their search listings. And do you list it by premium, by total cost of care, maximum out of pocket, deductible, or other,
Right. Well, it's interesting that you bring that up. There's very strict requirements now, as a web broker, how to display the plans. If you're white labeling on behalf of the carrier, you can only display their plans. You don't have to display their competitors, but you do have to display them in a certain order as defined by CMS. So it's interesting that there may be other options out there, but I know as more states are joining the SBM and need this way to have that technology, I'm I'm optimistic that there's ways to take some of the guardrails that have been put in place on the FFM and use those even with the third-party vendors who are going to allow that streamlined enrollment experience. You know, one thing that we're constantly looking at is the member experience and how quickly can you get them from top of funnel to enrolled, while, this is the key point, while understanding what it is they're enrolling in. Because this is not just buying something retail, this is buying your health insurance. So there's a lot of things that still need to be worked out, especially as people are moving. And I think there's a lot of discussion to be had, but I am of the optimistic variety that says this can be done.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there are some really, there's a lot of interesting possibilities, and the question is what should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed, in terms of the best, what's in the best interest of the enrollee, and that's what it's supposed to be all about. I know, like Idaho, which is, they were on the federal exchange the first year, and then they split off onto their own the second year. And it went through pretty seamlessly. I don't think they had any problems. They did something interesting a few years ago where they were trying to come up with a way to pay for it, to reduce the user fee, their own user fees and such. And so they started allowing banner ads on their site at Your Health Idaho. Now, you can see where that could create some serious conflicts of interest and potential issues of favoritism and so forth. But they had, I mean, and I haven't written about this in a couple of years, but they had meetings and discussions about what the policies would be, what types of ads would be allowed, and where they would be allowed. And I don't remember all the details of it, but there's all sorts of moral, ethical, legal,
yeah, for sure. There's a lot to go through. Charles, I could talk to you for hours about this. Thank you so much. I know you're finishing up doing your numbers from over the summer and this past year, and then we're going right into open enrollment, or maybe by the time this is published, we'll be in open enrollment. It's so close. I'm hoping you'll come back and speak with us at the end of open enrollment, and let's talk a little bit about the numbers and what met the expectations or exceeded or fell short.
Yeah, I'd like that. And of course, we didn't even have time to get into the big thing this year, which is, of course, the American Rescue Plan expanded subsidies. This is going to be the first year where they're, right out of the gate for the full year, where people get these massively expanded subsidies. There's no more subsidy cliff, the 400% income threshold and things like that. So it's going to be a really interesting open enrollment period, I think.
Definitely. And we'll have you back to talk about that too. Thank you so much, Charles. We really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Be well.